Kangi China Yanda Refuting, Muduchuan and Temple, Refuting, Dedancy, the Junior Refuting, and Chance of China, the La Charge. Oh, yeah. That's in Jetan Jetan, the Fobi Sanji, you command of Bushin and the Toba Cha, the Yeshe, Tambi Chusen, and the Guru Chanji, we sing the West, the December shoes. Oh,
So, to begin with, we should think for the sake of all sentient beings, I wish to attain the state of perfect, complete enlightenment. And so, for that purpose, I'm going to listen to these teachings.
oh, the Chaman, not the delays.
And good morning to everyone.
No, Tanga to Delia Swan, Niba, Tayuna, Simple Nimble, Temple Jebu Mebas. Kasha Vitadu Jibba Tadi, Kasha Vitadu Jibba de Yuna, and Simple Nimble Temple Jebu Yomaris, that Tanzima Babado, Tabatoya to Yamusel Yomarwa, Tiko Sudua, that the Chita Parapaka Viva. Dre Tad in the church and answer, Tarva Topsagami, come to the Vanessa, Dre Tad church answer. Dagri Simple Nega, Tini to never task. Chana ya tanda range to which I guitar yorba, the range to which I guitar, Tao Nyambanga o Nyambeshamba yorba, the range to which I get Tagi o Nyambe, Tagi o Shamba yorba, or Chilvan the Vanessian Tetu yorba yomaro, or Tiliness, Tagi or Shimba Nega Tini to never ta. Tanzi Joe Tadia, Nada, Nais, and the lonely Mayobanashi. Ranja to which I to Zimba and Dadu and Zimba never Tasura. Nabakun to Tatu Zimba and Mahishins, Tanda Ina Nimanashi, Tanda Tulia and Nabakundu, Ranja to which I to Tuban Zimba, Tatu Zimba and Mahishins, Tipayo Maris, Shayo Maris, Babiviches. Cover Taris, Nabakundu Tatu Zimba and Mabuna, and a Tata Dagrish Benegam Tini to take with this table Chavata. Never Chavata. Get Dala Shabat membership, a curing lancer. Tada Target Zimbabwe, Nai, some sort of Shabat membership, a curation. Tini Dagrish be Sabu to Zambia, Tadu Zimbatini, Tada Dagila Shabat membership, a cuna, Tini Dagrish be Sabu to Zambia, a Tanziki, a cuna, Dala Shabat cuna, Dagiwala Shabani, Sabu, Liver to Zambia. Oh, teacher, and it's all the number kundu tanzini tala shaba temper session. Number kundu thousand zimbatiana, let the girl shaba temper simulation. Can it dagri shaba sabu negati, thousand zimbatiana, Tagiwala shaba kiba sabu, and the Nimanashi or to give me negative in the English. Or it's our teacher, or teacher.
So here we'll pick up from where we left off in the text. This is the point on 441 in Roger Jackson's translation, which is showing that if the self exists, there can result no reliable antidote to desire. So here, this is saying that if you have such apprehension or grasping at a self, as do the Vaisesikas, which is the school that is being refuted here, then as long as you have that grasping at such a self, there's no way to get rid of the desire for that which is mine or seen as pertaining to the self. So it follows on 442 that that self that is freed will continue to desire what pertains to a self, even in that situation, as in when it is freed, because one does not change from grasping the self in all its aspects. So if there is such a self as these schools exist, like a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, and we haven't given up that kind of apprehension, then we're going to continue as before to grasp at that which is mine and have that kind of attachment or desire for that which pertains to the self. There's no change that has been made. So if it is the case that even when such a self is freed, one is going to have that apprehension of grasping at the self in all its aspects, then it means that one will still have that kind of attachment. Thus, this can't act as an antidote. So it follows that this reason pervades, or that this is logical, because that grasping is the cause that acts to support attachment to self. And because just that is the potent seed of desire for what pertains to the self. So, if it is the case that such a self exists, and thus an apprehension of a self is not to be undermined, then because you still have the cause for what generates attachment to that which is mine, there's no way that you could get rid of attachment to that which is mine, or those things that pertain to the self. So the root verse reads, one will continue in that situation, grasping the self in all its aspects. Grasping acts to support attachment to self, and just that grasping is the seed of desire for what pertains to the self.
Oh yeah. That is the tablet given the chance. Oh, Taba Dube, Taba top the gate which is Tanzi Mabana said, Zibati Mabana, Tagiwa Dungedo Kumbala Chayase, Chidama Chidabe Sonation, Tanzi Pangu Mare, Tagiwa de Tungedo Com Shagina, Nisha Pangugres or to take Marisubora. Tanzi Mabana, Tagiwa Tungedo Kumbala Chaya, Chabatese to Migude. Chabat Dana, Sawana Pagati, Yogimaris, Negum Negum, the Kokia Tadisa, your motions are sold to other Sira. Oh, to the Rangi get other day, one get Tagiwala, Chanta to give a cake, which a carriage and good to Tagi Unaya, Tangziti Mabamba, you did any Nada, some Sagish, Jati, this Gora. Rangi get other day, one get Tagiwala, Chanta to give a cake, Tangziti Tagiwala, Chanta to give a cake, Tanzi Mabamba. Nimanashidora. They go and do by MBS, and then go to Tana and go and to much as upon the Tibetis. Very taking by Tasha, they want to Tagi, and then you chas on all the 10 years. Tell a Chaguan to choose a Tagi while you then do carry that to so the Yamanashi, tell a Shenjaki videos, Shenjaki all the 10 years. Tagi while you then to so on the 10, tell a Chagua, going to use a Javan and then be citizen. Oh, that is our dealing with the workers for that. So, you then chat and answer the law. Tandy distributed Tanzi Mabana, Tagiwalani, Tunendo come to Chaba, Joyachi to Tombachana, as you were. So, you then chat and Judanse, oh, Tagiwalani, Chade cases, Tanzi, Tagiwala Chapa, the Javala case, Tanzi, Mabanga Manashita. Te kya de ba yin so ta ji te wa ge ta ge wa le kya yin na kya tu ya chi ba chi de sa wa de che o
So, continuing in the commentary, it says that it follows that a person who desires liberation, so a person who wants freedom from this, even if they exert themselves in meditation on the suffering of what pertains to the self, again, this is as the Vaisesikas assert, that one doesn't need to give up grasping at a self for liberation, but rather by meditating on the suffering of what pertains to the self. But the response to that is that, well, they won't be able to, will not thoroughly eliminate attachment if they do not abandon self grasping. Because the power of the self view in their own mind stream will prevent their detachment from what pertains to the self. And because it covers up the flaws in what pertains to the self. So here, if it is, as the Vaisesikas assert, that you don't need to give up that self grasping, maybe you can temporarily, by meditating on the faults of attachment, sort of give up attachment temporarily to that which is mine. But as that grasping or apprehension of a self remains without having been touched at all, then that's going to be an obstacle to giving up what is desired by the self. Because this kind of self grasping covers up the flaws in what pertains to the self. And it follows that this is the case because by the power of that self view, based upon seizing the good quality part of what pertains to the self, one engages in manifest attachment to self and will be reborn. So, just meditating on the sufferings that pertain to the self, or pertain sufferings related to that which pertains to the self, doesn't let us get rid of that attachment, because as long as we have this kind of self view that remains as before, it is going to act as a cause of covering up flaws in that which pertains to the self and grasping on those good quality parts. So, as the root verse says, even if a person exerts themselves, self grasping prevents detachment and covers up the flaws in what pertains to the self. Based on the good quality part of what pertains to the self, one engages in attachment. Mm,
Tarba Topsan, Koran Devanashi, Tarba Topsan, and Nega Tanayaseva. Dagua sent the Alaya Sabata Telushanasi, Chidama Chula, Chidaba Chula, Tarba Tobenegam so, Negana, Dagua sent Dagua, Samu Devanashi, Talayani, Samu Yomaris, Tadus of the Samute Yomaris and Asigora. Dagua sent Alaya Sabata Telushanas, Alaya Sabata Telisana. Tatil Katagiora. Chidako Nabachana Tabato the Negana, Tagiwala Shabbat the Dagri, Tala Shabbat the Tegra. Tanda Chida Koran Devanashana, Ran Tabato the Taji Ramacha to Zimbetag, Zimbati Deora, Taji Ramacha to Zimbetag, Zimbate Oda, and Tagiwa Rave Tadi, Mignawa Shabbat Tagi, Sabbat Teddy Ora. Tigana Tulki Maresh. Ako legend or the dog is something you married, Dagi is something you married. That's some look on a Mengeshara. Could na some sort of some look on a Mengeshara. And Abasanje Venoko Ranget to which I will get down to but you are Maramato. She don't tell it about some Yora. That other Chitaba then the top of the Dash as you are Tayuna, round it out to some Yogora, round it out to some Lume. Mes tanji mes riti mes sigora ti mane taag samlo yamara tini taada dagre samlo mege ne chamlo ta taada dagre samlo che mege chamlo gora ni taada mege ne suya mesin ne chamlo de sigora oya eti tharbe negam na dage wasin do taala ya chapa da telo shenase tane tharbe negam na chade ji ta kai batya mevata ta kera tharba to suna chade ji negam na chapa da telo taade mege cha so asigora Tell a shamba don't as a some never asura. Taji Miyamaro. Taji Manning has some there. Tell a shamba don't as Suja Meshibes. I ever the Kuragi has some Yamari, Shanda Gation Mari. Takora Menge use of Asigura. Do not tell a tato vessel to make combat to meet in Durata. Tell a tato vessel to Taba to vessel. Kale Jabia Jav to any bata. Do I? Any bata. Tando tene chidar dagyo asendo taja dorvesere ta tarba tutu jan soso mege chadu ba chichaswa me samlo me de namba ina rangya to be ngata ngayo samlo yomar mado chida dire de mare samlo de deira chacho be ina ko samlo deira ta de mege chasoba kare sene ngayo samlo ina rawa ngayo samlo de yo bra kondumeshi chela o tise ta de chawade Tani kala chante, tani chante kahin kime, tera ke chamba da kasa sengeti menge shabre sora. Te chidar dan doro ase, tunge komba tume jo, tagi ve samlo tagi samlo kaga kai ke menge shabra. Ene tunge le teve situ kale jabati tume res, ten yuke res. Tawadi cha, otis.
mm. So here, then it continues with the Vaiseshika opponent saying, well, at the time of liberation, just as one is freed from attachment to what pertains to the self, one is also freed from attachment to the self. So here they are trying to say, well, if you get rid of that attachment to the mind, then at the time of liberation, there will be no attachment to that self either. So for them, they're trying to say that, okay, well, at the time of liberation, there is no thought of I or mine. We've gotten rid of that kind of attachment. So here, according to our own system as a Buddhist, we would say, well, yes, you are at the time of of a liberation, freed from any kind of grasping at a self. But it's not that there's no self whatsoever. You're freed from that kind of apprehension of a self as being a self-sufficient, substantially existent entity, a kind of autonomous, independent self. But if it is, as the Vaisesikas assert, such a self actually exists, then to say that the apprehension of that self is gone at the time of liberation, how could you even say that there is a self that has been liberated? It couldn't be cognized or known by anyone. So here, the opponent says, at the time of liberation, just as one is freed from attachment to what pertains to the self, so one is also freed from attachment to self. Now, we respond, it follows that at the time of liberation, there does not exist any self that is freed from attachment, because since desire for it has been rejected, it is not cognized by anyone. So, if it is, as they say, there's no attachment anymore to a self sufficient, substantially existent self, and that's the kind of self that they posit to exist, then there must be no self whatsoever. Whereas for the Buddhists, for our school, this is not a problem, because when you achieve liberation, it's not that there's no self. There is a designated kind of self, a self that exists as a mere designation. But there isn't a self. We've gotten rid of the apprehension of a self as being, at least according to this text, a self-sufficient, substantially existent entity. But for them, that is the way in which a self needs to exist. And so if there is no such apprehension of a self, then as it says here, since desire for it has been rejected, it is not cognized by anyone. So, if this is asserted, it follows that it is pointless to meditate on suffering for the sake of obtaining a freed self. Because how could that one who desires liberation even reject the self later, any more than what pertains to the self? So, here for them, this problem occurs that if they have abandoned this kind of grasping at a self sufficient, substantially existent self and the mind of that self, but yet that is the way that the self actually exists for him, then you would have to say that you've abandoned the self. Whereas it's not taught by our particular school that you get rid of an idea of self whatsoever, but rather that understanding is that it's a merely designated kind of self. So in the root verses it says, if you assert that one is freed from attachment to self, we reply, now, since there does not exist any self freed from attachment, it will be pointless to meditate on suffering, for how could that person reject the self?
Oh, yeah. Then you better to combat some to turn a hazard tower, Chicago pass your one. Turn to never combat Mato Tame, Geshe, your Mato Kajir. Next time, ever Makumba to never some combat. Shenjara soba sawane pangpa di kumara. Kuchita tungeva kompa di shenja thawli de dungde de. O disiba. Niba tungeva kompa tsamdi tuana haja tawa ase. Tami to muguva se. Tunge chendu kompa tsamdi. Tunge mule tendu. Tendu guva tela haja tawa re. Tawa guva da shenla chate misiba. Haja tawa de ku. Ani shen chidabari ya. Chate sengi di si maris tengwa. Ta dambu haja tawa de wa. Hajanawadi. Nenjuba Deda Shishigo. Tagiwa to Nedo Combat Shay Yash, Tarba to the Chit Gay Nenjuba Tisigo. Chita Nenjuba said, Nelson, Nelve to Yanda Beturia, Sepjora, Telego, the Yash, Shilas would be Nenjur Unity of Telego, Tachita Nenjuba Nenjua Show, from Java the Shore. Nenjuba Deda Shishay. Dagi wala tungedo komba she yas. Dagi wala tungedo komba she ne teda komba lina yas goto. Teda na ya tene chawde do tesam ji yola mai bata. Tungewa komba cham je tesam je ten koale tungele ten do tele. Ya mole ten do tele chawde do kumara shi yamo chawde do ade ne do de gote de se to. Oh. Dagi wa tungedo komba she ya teda na ya ten chawde do tesam je yola mai tambe kombo de namba chena. Rāwe tātā nāi sāṅgā sāṅgā nēva sōguyō tō, tātā tō tē mā sō tē rāñcā kē mā tā shishāni, tōngē tō kōmbā tē thālā mī shīgō tō. Tēn tō chā tē tō tē tsam kē gyūrā mē bā tā, tōngē nī nāmbar shēbā tē nē mā kōmbē, ngā rīyā nē lā sōbē. Tōngē wā shēbā tsam tē tē tōngē wā mā kōmbē ngē nē, chitā mē rē kō nā tsā tē chōng tō kushirā chōng nē kō tōngē tē shīngi wā rā. Tungeni number sheba tene magombe Maria Nella sobe simbe chesi nada tukule shoji nabene da tukule bade da agora tungeni musum tomuda musum yedo tome chese kede ngare tewa jebe jula ya jeba tona chade dirida dirangu ba kago chigoto kire tawate kita adelia Teda tunge kombe ya tunge ne namshi chesi wa ne joba teda tunge kombe tunge number shene kombe ina ya sigora tene ngare angu sumi teta de tarwa togu mades tunge sheba tamde ngare komma je bene go chidan bila ya ne naza duja chinduja musum bishin kristene tene ngare angu sumi tena chade tena teda na ya chade meso tami ma komba ya tunge bisheba teta de chade do tene chade do to sawaderwa
So then we turn to the next topic, which is the extreme consequences if one is freed merely by meditating on suffering. So here again, this is directed at a Vaisesika opponent, where one is saying that it's impossible to be freed from just meditating on suffering without realizing selflessness. So first, presents an actual extreme consequence, and then the impossibility of others being freed from attachment, the impossibility by just meditating on suffering that one could be freed from attachment. So here, this is saying that you cannot get rid of the root of suffering by just meditating on suffering without knowing selflessness. So it follows in the commentary then that those Vaisheshika yogins, and here the word yogi is usually referring to like a meditator, and then naldor is like sort of coming together of usually this is placing the mind in a correct understanding of reality, like having a combination of calm abiding and special insight. But here are referring to Vaisheshikas who are meditating, engaged in a kind of practice of their own meditation on suffering. And even if they know suffering, by meditating on the suffering of what pertains to the self, will not thus become thoroughly detached by that meditation alone. Because we see by direct perception that cognizance of suffering already exists before one meditates, as when one is sick. So again, the Buddhist the Buddhist opponent is saying, or our side is saying, that in order to remove that kind of suffering result, one needs to remove the root of grasping at an I and a mine. And in response, they're saying, oh no, you just need to meditate on the suffering of what pertains to the self. Well, generally, we don't need to meditate in order to understand suffering. When we are sick, we know that we are suffering. When we experience any kind of suffering kind of feeling, we don't need to meditate on that. We just already know that we are experiencing suffering. So this kind of direct perception allows us to cognize suffering without any kind of meditation. So the root verses that go with this say, those Vaisheshikas, even by meditating on suffering, will not thus become detached. It is known by direct perception that cognizance of suffering already exists before. So we can already recognize suffering, and that's something that is not able to free us. Without having this realization of selflessness, we can't be freed.
Look did a castle. A catchy sula budua. Getting out of the Quebec, Julia and Yebatona. Chante to Euro Tomeshi, to make over Chante, Julian Ocean as Yadasula. Getting out of the Quebec, Jutusulia, Coquente, etc. And it could give you to Zula and Yamachashi at the Tandako Chapa the Jadu Asagara. Getting out of the Quebec, Julia and Yabatonas, Quente de Samutani Come, Quentoina. Chade to Jura Tomish, Intelli and Yamashinja in the Tanda Chade to go Tomish. To me, Comba Chade, you nationals, or Dumia community, Chade, you read them out of Damito was what the Kumasi. She not that Ramupa Angel. Dala ale kachin dagat silona.
So here, then the opponent comes back with this idea. Well, because we see that one becomes detached when one sees fault in that which has previously been a cause generating pleasure, meditation on suffering is the cause of detachment. So they're coming back again and saying that, well, the cause of detachment is seeing the fault in something. So by meditating on the fault or by meditating on suffering, this will act as the cause of detachment. Thus, one doesn't need to meditate on selflessness, but rather by seeing the fault in something, one will be able to generate a sense of detachment.
Oh yeah, tara lu pala budwa. Dala chabe kibuti chuch hasi budwa. Kete yu de la nyeba tong la yeshe. Dala chabe kibuti ge. Ene ta ge dewa soba dewa jiwe shitu zule pa. Kente che. Kente du komsona sura. Kete yu de la nyeba tong la ye chakde du minjuro atasi. De chambi chakde du yutu kumare shigora. Karishna Yeba Tove Kichi Tetamla Chapati Lojas, Pena Casa de Chilia, Geshe and Tayabu Medusamina, Hotel Negateleco, Colia Shenja Nemanashi, Shenja de Tadu. Yeba Tove Kichi Tetamla Chapati Loja, Tela Chapa Loja, Tela Chapa Jevises. Ore, Yebaton Keji Tesamle Chapa de Loja, Yan Cheso, Telechapa Chigres, Wara. Penase, Dende Pemichila, Yebaton Vesese, Pimento Chilia, Co Madrid, Kendra Mabus Tosona, Nema Shenja Yubanashi, Shenja Belchavi, Shenja, the Tegris, Wara, Negutena, Negumundu, I tell you, don't tend at it all. Shenja that Tayas, Yan Pemishana Chapa Kishes. Kotele Shinja Tower Mother Shandal Shinja Tower Mother Shali Chapachires. Yan La Yang made the Koso Shinja Kiva Hungris Wara. Yan Chishula Kiva Shinos. They should answer. Chabe Kivi Chuzas Wara. Oh, you call ya Chapatense, my boy, you can get your never come to tell it Chapamudiva, never want to meet you some Chapatene. Give you a chagma reservoir. You can't Chapatense, my bata. You chill a lanja that torture touch to Shembe, Cabaret. I used to the Tajibo, Rana Kogo, but I'm going to today some ships and the Chapa give at the town to what you go this way. Cabata usually mean enjoy a chapa kind, but any can't get number to give it, round the chapa, good summer. Casachilia, usually I mean enjoy a chapa, give you a day, you know, Shandachi chapa over in there. Usually I mean enjoy a chapa kind, but any Yankee Shanda the trash me, you Shanda the rest to chapa game with this water. Can't get number to give it, say, Randa Chapakundi, Kaba in a coach Chapaki, Gucci civilization. Oh, teacher, that is Zawati to say lotion. Can't tell a nearby kitchen, the Lord Dogase. Geshe is some time and connect of the Gati Cochapa, when you are the mail child, on the Gati Bell child. Tell a child, and do the tennis chapa the child, you go marish. Yan Chapa Shandali, Chapaki, any ally and tell a Chapaki. Then they may shine as she is. Landa Torje K. Yunas, touch the Landa Torja Shenja Yuna, and the Chile Chaka, Chaba Shichilia, Laba to Chaba, Koko Shiji Tone, 这个现在有呢，这个就是查看，今年还决定现在说是那现在来过查过这个，鸡蛋过查过帮来着。今年咱们这决定的咱们这现在先给这个是，你查过过去啥不也是？俺现在的可以那个。get over the sabun that you sent it somewhere. Oh, this
So here, then again, it follows that a person. So again, sorry, I'm like finding. Okay, so a person who is detached or who is attached to the self will not become thoroughly detached by seeing the fault in relation to that object. So again, the opponent has made this point that by seeing the faults in an object or by seeing the fault in attachment, one can, in suffering even, can give rise to detachment. But the response then comes that it follows that a person who is attached to the self will not become thoroughly detached by seeing faults in relation to that object. Because even if that attached thought is absent for just a moment, it when one sees the fault, attachment to that object can arise again. So by meditating on the faults of something, one may be able to temporarily get rid of some of that manifest attachment. By actively seeing the faults in an object, one may not be experiencing attachment toward that object, but it doesn't mean that one has achieved a state of detachment because one hasn't removed the cause of giving rise to that attachment. So, for example, although a desirous male is free from attachment at the time when he sees fault in one woman, attachment can arise in relation to another woman, and it will arise in relation to that other. So we can see the faults of one particular object and thereby not have manifest attachment toward that. But so long as we don't get rid of the cause of that attachment, when we turn to another object, we will give rise to that same kind of attachment. So, with respect to one object, you can perhaps see the faults, but you're still fundamentally going to grasp that that which is desirous to the self or wanting to be rejected by the self. So it continues that it follows that that person attached to the self does not thoroughly eliminate attachment toward any object because he distinguishes in regard to a single object. On the one hand, desire for what is to be adopted, like the things that we want, and on the other, aversion for what is to be rejected. So, what will benefit this self is going to be adopted. We're going to want that. And something that we consider to be harmful is going to be rejected automatically. So, it follows that this reason pervades because whatever attachment originates from one's intending one object, just that is the seed of all attachment that will result when generated by the specific appropriate conditions. So again, although by seeing the fault in one object, we can perhaps temporarily remove manifest attachment for that object, so long as there is this seed of an apprehension of a self, there's going to be the seed of attachment to that which is beneficial to the self and that kind of aversion toward that which is not. And this is the seed of all of our various attachment that is going to arise when specific conditions are encountered. So, like, say, a man who has meditated or seen the faults in one woman, he may not be attached to her anymore, but another object comes along and attachment is still there. So, the root verses then say, we reply, one will not become detached in relation to that. Even if that attached thought is absent for a moment, it may return, as a desirous male may reject a lover, then turn to another woman. One distinguishes what is to be adopted and what is to be rejected. Whatever attachment originates from a single object, just that is the seed of all attachment, when attachment is generated by its specific conditions.
touch it to the ten chocolate to the George of my massage. I came it to an Indian to buy in I did Ranga to Rawadu to Bachiware, Rawadu to Bayasam, the Rawadu to Badig, also Tingal something a man as it ora. What did I came it to an Indian saying basic. I came in should watch it. Raweta Ranga to Beta, Tajiroji, Dadi Yora, the Tanga Tajiroji, Raweta the Yosam, Raweta long church and the ins and Tiku use of some of the Deora, number 10. Kenje to combat amado. Tani te tenye ki vije kasi. Adala chaba chuje taja to chaba da tawa chama ibada. Tai kemi te tenye ki duba ibeche. Ko samlata ya te norme dua. Chaba se ya te da ko nyamo ine ngobe nechu la mane bache. Ngobe nechu da mitu bache jing sona. Ine ko samlate tocha te duara. Ngobe nechu da tinte samlate ina. Ecco, torbe io amato, di suresne su di sure di su mare se si amato. O ti ne si che rave ta Yeshe rave ta di Yeshe di rave ta te le ta di va ko io vale. Tiene ti che re me do ti pa me do si do. O dai. Ta la chaba ci che ta che do chaba da da cha mai ba sa. Yo. Ta che me te ni di ba i bese, che me le do. Sanje tendo nyawashina ngarazo kenku se yende kundengi kibuche sinjenge to jubete to toga chagi samna kote shenjake marton sinje tamje to jube kasa ya buche tendo nyawate ta keme te tangi de bai bese kana sanje tendo nyawata bos onso jane chuje keme imbata rawe ta ga longcheja rawe ta ga tewe june rawe ta ga tewa kichila soba Ongola soba tende samluta te ko chemele te wala. Ne waso jane chuje keme imbata kora samba na shimo ne chule ne ba imbata. Tene ta keme te tuchi imbese. Ta keme te ko te tuchi to ko be ese sora. Kya jebe shoba shene spena ga jo sanje to zoli kya jebe shoba phigo ha. Oti kya jebe shoba phigo ne te ko chaba ke de yo ma to. Oti ne shi ko kemele de wasi lo. Oh, Sawati. Keme yujen chakba da tuji dane keme yinserwa. Tadi keme taji rawa chen du tubare diore. Ani te gogo tuji mewa nawala soba te tuji tewe tuji ki junere diore. Te kongo yune chule keme batane shine de yuna. Te samlu te ko toria ke yo marato. Sawati re. O dis bachi duna.
So here then it turns, the next point is the impossibility of others being freed from attachment. So again, this is referring to these others like Vaisesikas who are not able to be totally freed from attachment through their method of just meditating on suffering. Again, so it says in the commentary, on 445 that it follows that attachment to self does not in the end act to free one from attachment, because the object for which it strives is a flawless self, as when one strives for Buddhahood. So here the Vaisesikas assert that there is like a self-sufficient self, a self that is autonomously established. And so if that assertion is faultless, that actually accords with reality, then that's not something that needs to be gotten rid of. We don't need to get rid of such an apprehension of a self, or apprehending a self as being an autonomous, self-sufficient entity, if that actually accords with reality. And if that accords with reality, then anything that is related to that should also not be something that is going to be rejected. That would also not be flawed. So, if you are grasping in a way that is directly contrary to reality, this is something that should be rejected, that one would want to get rid of. But if it is the case that apprehending such a self sufficient, substantially existent self or an autonomous self actually is in accord with the way that things are, then it would not be something that is at fault. Thus, striving for the things of that self or apprehending the mind of such a self would also not be at fault. They would be flawless as well. Just like in the way that when one strives for Buddhahood, when you make that kind of aspiration, we don't talk about that as being attachment. That is actually, and striving for that would not be seen as like grasping, because that object is something that is flawless. That's what one is striving to get. And so, again, the commentary then turns to saying that it follows also that the sense faculties too must be flawless because they accomplish the pleasures of that flawless self, such as offerings to please the conqueror. So here, this again is if one believes that the self, the way that one perceives the self is in accordance with reality, then those ways of pursuing the pleasure of the self must be flawless as well, like in the way that we make offerings to the conquerors in order to accomplish that goal of Buddhahood. So now, toward what will there be for a Vaiseshika freedom from attachment? Um, Sorry, so that at that point, this is something that isn't seen as being flawed in any way, the idea of the self. So that which pertains to the self could also not be flawed. So the root verses read: attachment has an object, the self, that is flawless. What pertains to the self also must be flawless, as it accomplishes the pleasures of the self. Now, toward what will there be freedom from attachment?
Oh yeah. Tani chitaba shujense do ta number with paraputwa chitaba. Tani chitaba shujense. Kala ya chaba da tewa yo miteba da. Kira chena. Ene ne lu lonje da soba kala ya chaba da tewa. Tani chaba da tewa yo de te ma res miteba da. Da da te yu chen da. Da takji rawa chen da rawa da ne ki ma na shi sab te de do ase. Ti samu de ne ma na shi yo ba se. Da te yu chen na samsa rawa da de wa. Da ki wa su da ngai long che che ke da ki wa takji rawa chen de rawa da de long che che mi wa na wa che wa lu wa so kwa su de te de sha so kwa te zo da ki wa jin be samu de ne ma na shi wa ro ase ko ra te te wa ra da ki wa su ga kwe mi ti ka ga kwe mi che da da te te wa ra ti kwe pa je ke de mu do che ra che na Kinani draw call you and there's some need to give you this some of the dealer have a kayama, Tion the call cogioris, Tion the Shinjaki, Tion the any Chataki, Teletin call cogioris. Do a call the Chumar Chibe, you there's some need to me by the basis. Oh, Tiba the Chituna. Yeah, that's all the data. Draw on, there's some ye in us and draw on call, do some 다 라와 다 라와 짐바다 다게 라와 짐바 어디 괜히 인상 짐바 테레스 거야 또한 대자마다 생각요 과거에 좋아 대자니나 다니 강라 차데 줄세 다니 지다바치 네 강라 차데 줄아 미테바 사시거다 차데 줄데 미주아 사시거다 결대 견제 장 인하세 결대 견제 장 인하세 되려고 dikasi doshina kowa kowa ne terisi wara dagi wada kenje jayinde marmara tadi woli yugdwa terite kenje jayina se kachi dogare woli wanti nyamdo lakshana kwa dire da doa tezam do ngebe chitin deswa kowa ne dire dagi wa kenje jayinde te dungegi de chechena se ya chulabdwa kowe ne de dagi wa de kyunje ja yin de tume ke be che na se a chola wa de kyunje ja yin na o ta ja lu ka pa du ho le do wa te pa de chi na
So here again, I read a little one sentence ahead. So it says now. toward what will there be for a Vaisesika freedom from attachment? So it's not acceptable if there is such a self as the Vaisesikas assert, that is like a self-sufficient entity, an autonomous self, and there then would be the things enjoyed by that self, the mind that is connected with that. It follows that it is unacceptable that there be detachment from anything, because the self, its object, and what pertains to the self are all three flawless. And because it is nevertheless certain that just that belief in flawlessness is also the cause binding transmigrating beings in samsara. So here, what is being said is that how could there be a freedom from attachment for such a being as a Vaisheshika who asserts that there is such a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, and that actually accords with reality. And if that is the case, then it would follow that all of those things that are sort of enjoyed by that self or used by the self, our eyes, our ears, our nose, our tongue, body, and so forth, all of the kind of objects that we enjoy, they would also have to be flawless, or because they pertain to such a flawless self, or a self that exists in that way. And the response to that is, well, it's precisely that misapprehension, that grasping at such a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, that apprehension of it as flawless, that causes sentient beings to migrate in samsara. That's what's binding us into this force, or into this taking rebirth in samsara. It's due to the force of that apprehension of such a self, and mine, and so forth. So the opponent comes back by saying, in that abode that is samsara, that which pertains to the self is indeed flawed because it generates suffering. So again, they're not going to admit that the self is flawed, but rather that that which pertains to such a self is flawed. It's that attachment to those things that are considered mine that is the problem, but not actually the self, the apprehension of a self itself. So here, then, it follows that the self is. So our response then will come below. So it says, if you say that. Just that belief in flawlessness. So now, toward what will there be freedom from attachment? Just that belief in flawlessness is also the cause of transmigrating. If you say that in that case, that which pertains to the self is indeed flawed, so they're trying to say that it's just that which pertains to the self which is flawed, not the self. And our response will come below.
Oh, yeah. I did it. I looked at the Tanda Sitaba Karisana. Koya Neder, Kobe Nega Delia, Tagia di Tunje, Tungi, Chenasua. That did by legend, Tajan Tunjen to touch. Net Tajan Tunje Basa. To make it but the Tala Sumbus, Koya Nega, Target to make it versus Tajan Basumbuses. Tajan Tunje Bata. To make it but the Tala Sumbus. Then you can't lie, you would chapa that tower, Minjuata, Atashira, Tani, you Tanis were at tennis, Tani, you can't lie, give the charter to Minjuata, you can't say, you can't lie and chapa the tower, you maris. Carison, Koyan de Ta, take Tonyas, Koyan de Gavna, Ta, take Tonya, tell a chapa the tower, Chani to Melis, chapa the trail, Melis, Sigurdo. Gentle Thomas and Billy Chapote to Mare. Tommy combated the Kelly give a marto. Oh, this all the Caressana. Tani Kala, Chumber Juice, Tani Kala Chumber Juice. Tani you Kala, Kibu the Chabata Tower Mijura Talse. Tani Kala Chumbai. Tete Kela Chake Mese, Koyane Tersura, Tadi Tonya Tela Chak to Chabata Church on the Meves. Oh, it's all the shit, yeah.
So then the response to this comes with Gyaltsab saying that it follows that the self is also flawed because that which generates suffering is the same as the self in status. So here, if it is if they're trying to say that it is the sort of apprehension of that which pertains to the self or is the object of the self that is flawed because it generates suffering, well, that has the same sort of status as the self. And so now, in relation to what object will that person be detached, it follows that they will not be detached in regard to any, because they see the flaws of that self in the abode of samsara, but do not act to free themselves from attachment to the self. So here, even if because they see that which is mine or that which is sort of apprehended as pertaining to the self as being flawed, even if they come then to say, well, then the self must be flawed, they still haven't removed the kind of attachment. They aren't removing the basic seed of that apprehension of a self, and thereby they're not able to free themselves from attachment to that self. So here in the root verses, it says, we reply, that is the same as the self. Now, in relation to what will one be detached? Seeing the flaws of that which pertains to the self in that case does not free one from attachment. So, even if one tries to hold this position that it is what pertains to the self that is flawed, that doesn't allow one to remove attachment to such a self. One isn't able to move to that position where one thinks that such an apprehension of the self is what needs to be removed.
Oh yeah. The one so can to Tonga some get tell us Shamban dog one motion yourself in door. Or tell your subject in your door. Can Tonga some Shamban dog get you my issue. One so the Jidder you be Gun Tonga Sigmas. Gun Tonga some Shamban dog get you the room out there. You one so the Jidder you be Gun Tonga Chimachi Tonga Sigmas. Oh, the detention you go there. One so can to Tonga some Shamban dog. Tindogu mare tu musundi hako to grace ba musundi sawasa. Oh, ade ta tambo kasere. Kenja do toa sa bishba dobe mai badra. Chala chaba chujese. Chala tachi do niba toye kö jije dor yode. Kö change yode. Toa le soye sheba yebese. Ta tambo dira. Chala chaba chujese. Chala tachi do niba 통에 그 이제 도와를 못해서 차를 잡아 가서 그 차리야 타지도 거기도 삼지 창통에 오면도 삼이 내가 마음보다니 잘해서야 다시 내가 투셔서야 마음보다 어디에 삼을다네 차를 잡아 가서 지지야서 차를 타지도 이바 통에 그 이제 도와를 못해서 이 차리야 잡아도 내가 차그래서 그 창게 연데 통에 통화를 중에 신발이 미래치세. 와, 걔네 대다른 원소라 신발이 꽤 통화권에 중앙 민발 사서 어디를 대담마디 뭐를 연대 통화를 중에 신발 미가 통화지세. 처음에 잡아 주제 타지도 내가 통에 꽤 지지 도와를 못해 그 창게 연대 통화를 주 신발이 같이 줄라고도
No.
상관이 주제하세. 상을 타지도 예바 통해 최지지도 그래서 잡아봐도 그래서 와라. 그래서는 상을 잡아대 최창의 연대 통화를 때니 좋아. 이게 제시가 뒤줄라기도 와. 연대 통화를 중에 신발 예바 통해 지으셔야 자와들라. 연대 통화를 중에 신발 예바 통해 지. 상을 잡아서 타지도 예바 통해 최지지 도와를 못해 그 창기 연대 통화를 중에 신발이 비치. 연대 통화를 중에 신발이 받아야지. 어를 되지도나. 뒤까지 줄라고도 와. 아,
No. Mhm. So then here we turn to showing a perceptually based computation of the idea that merely by seeing the sense faculties, etc., or that which pertains to the self as flawed, one can remove desire for them. So here, this is first showing that just seeing flaws is not the cause for removing desire, and secondly, showing the impossibility of seeing flaws as they are in the sense faculties, etc. So here, the basic premise is that showing that just seeing the flaws in something is not necessarily the cause for removing desire for those things. So, and this is something that we can know from direct perception. It's going to give us a direct kind of example. So it begins with the opponent's assertion that says, attachment to liquor, etc., will be destroyed and rejected when one sees that there absolutely are faults in liquor, because attachment is a desire that arises from seeing the good qualities of the liquor. So, the opponent is saying, well, if one thoroughly recognizes that liquor is flawed, you see that it makes you sort of ruin your work and you get into fights and you can't accomplish things and so forth. That kind of understanding of the flaws is going to lead to getting rid of desire for that, attachment to that, because they assert our desire for something arises from seeing the good qualities in that. In this case, the desire for alcohol or liquor arises from seeing the good qualities of the liquor. So the root verse then is the first two lines where it says, if you assert that desire is destroyed when one sees faults in an object, since desire arises from seeing its good qualities, and then the reply will come below.
老也当然路吧，就是吧。แต่ถ้าเรา说了先把第一些，我们说了先下的说差不多些，差不多的原点通啊，可能就还明白啥些，当然路吧搞不出吧，可这个原点通啊的点没去嘛的是大点多了吧，哦，แต่ถ้า我说了说过了先下可的是呢，这差不多基于这个原点通啊的点的去怎么的是吧，แต่ถ้า说。like the means to get the right so was the one sort of the one sort of the one sort of somebody the union to a connection and means the one sort of the means ci sono ya tonche danse che non mi mesce ci va la ya somebody tonche che da union the nam sam mesce ci va la ya and somebody you are is what one sort of senza di ore is que nami meshi be chiba so la ya shimba de tong ye che da shi chi so la ya tong che da shi de ba wo bu gen je la ya shimba ye be shi yen de jang jang tong ko ma re cha pa ya so so yin ba chang ju chen ji ne gen je yin na ya wo bu gen je de ne so so wo bu de shen ja yu gu de wo gen je la ya shen ja de ba tong ye che da shi yen de ya shen da la me che shi Yudenda Daya Shaji Mingla Sobatala, Yudenda Debari de Telia, Rangi Loki Mashinjaki Maresura. Yudenda Shaji Misola, Rangi Miso Shiba Megilasi, Shinjaki Mares. Yudenda Shandala Meseris. Deva La Soba Dagola Meses. Yudenda Yina, Yudeva Yinaya, Rangi Tagri Songa, Deve Tala Sobatala, Dada. Dagivation by Megasis. Mason Deba lost over Dagola Meseros, or Timber to Chiguna.
No. So then, in response to this opponent's assertion that it is by seeing the good qualities of something that one gives rise to desire, the response then comes, thus it follows that desire for the sense faculties, etc., does not originate thus, simply from one's having seen their good qualities. So we respond that no, it isn't just based upon seeing the qualities of something that one gives rise to desire for them or attachment to them, like especially in regard to, say, our sense faculties. Because even in children, etc., who do not know how to distinguish flaws from good qualities, we see desire. Children who aren't able to distinguish what is a good quality or what's a flaw still have this kind of innate desire, attachment to their sense faculties. And because we have desire even for a flawed sense faculty, so something does not have to be solely beneficial or solely considered to be good or unflawed for us to give rise to attachment. Even if we have a flawed sense faculty, we are still going to apprehend that as something that is that we want, or we're going to have desire for that despite it's not being solely a good kind of a thing. And it also is the case that we do not desire, because we do not desire the good quality eyes, etc., of others as our own eyes. So we can see the good qualities of an object. We can see, oh, that person has really good sight, but we don't want those for ourselves or desire them as being mine. And because hairs that have been shed, etc., which previously were apprehended as having good qualities when they pertained to the self, will not be desired as pertaining to the self. So here we can see that something that was previously we had desire for as being part of the self, like our hair, our nails, and so forth, once they are removed from our body, the quality hasn't changed, but yet we don't have that desire for them. So there's not an invariable concomitance between seeing the good qualities of something and generating desire for it. So the root verses then say, we reply that desire for the sense faculties, etc., is not thus, because even in children, etc., we see desire, because we have desire even for a flawed sense faculty, because we do not desire the good quality traits of others, and because what has been shed, etc., will not be seen as pertaining to the self.
Oh yeah, that denash. Also, Tagiwari Simbe Lui Juyasada. Also, Tagiwari Simbe Lui Judan Karistua. Yunden Tonga Konecheva Mares, where I can Yunden to Tonga Digi. Also, Tagiwari Shinjaki Mariswa, Titania Mares, then also Tagiwari Simbe Lui Juya. Yunden to Tonga Konecheva members house. Tinichina Tagiwari Lujua, Yunden Tonga means at our to do. Teacher, you and then mean to me at the home minus. Tell a chest of the dog basis. Oh, dear. You and then send to Tona. You are the violation back to the Yundation to Tona, Mother. You and then send to Tona. Shenjak giving about your mother, Shandy, you had to do like Shenjak. Oh, then a ragged Kunjan, you want to do like Shenjak you are. Shenjak, you are you and then send to Tonga, so one would get necessary some Shenjak you got. Such as on the dog true as an issue or not. Geshe do the dogbas, Geshe do dog. You then also Tagiwari Simbe Lui Juya, you then told a Konesheva Mares, Kares Shenjati da, you then told a Jason to talk in Dog Documentos, Dog Documentos, what you then told you then told a Yuna, Shenjati giving never your Mares, Shenji you then. Oh, today, that's a minor Georgia in a young question Jackie, you are rather one book in Zetolia, so the Shanjaki or Jason to talk trees and draw trees as it were. To the unit, David unit to the Neva York, to the man of David Mitchell, Jason to talk to Meduswara. Do now you and that's maybe a Georgia to Tommy, sympathy upon my impertas, or just on that. You and that's maybe Georgia to Tommy. Sympathy upon my important services. So, 20 to 20 simple point, and do with us. Teach you then mean to let them upon my nose start.
So here, therefore, it follows that it is not the case that just seeing the good qualities of the sense faculties, etc., is the cause of the thought desirous of what pertains to the self. Um, because that assertion that there is positive and negative concomitants is mistaken. So it isn't the case that just seeing something as having good qualities is the cause of generating desire for that. And it's not just by recognizing something as being flawed or seeing the faults in it that one is able to get rid of the sort of apprehension of that or the grasping at that. Again, we can see this in the case of, like, say, if we have imperfect sense powers, we still apprehend them as mine and have this kind of attachment and desire for them as being mine. And we also can say see the qualities of someone else's sense powers, but we don't give rise to attachment toward those. So basically, it is responding that the relationship between these two is mistaken. There's no invariable connection between seeing the qualities of something and generating this kind of desire or sense of wanting it as pertaining to the self, or seeing the flaws in something and rejecting all desire for that. So, because they haven't established such an invariable kind of cause and effect relationship, and we can see this through the kind of examples that were given above. And it continues saying, if that is asserted, it follows that one will not abandon that desire through seeing as faulty what does not have good qualities because of that assertion, because of the assertion that just by seeing something as faulty, as not having those good qualities, does not mean that we can extricate our attachment to it. As it says, in the last part of this root verse, that um, it is not the case that seeing good qualities is the cause of the thought of what pertains to the self because of that previous assertion. One will not abandon that desire through seeing non good qualities because of that previous assertion. Again, that there's not this invariable link between seeing the flaws and giving up attachment, or by seeing good qualities and having attachment.
Oh, yeah. I did a one saw the cheater, you be good to my misibas. One saw the condition with that, yeah, she makes you sit on this in my race. One saw to me to come back, to Tom, cheater, you but in a shit on and give her my race. You are never toss. Shaya tell her, you ever made the day told up with Sabay, you then, Jerry Thomas. You then be able you then to go down in Sabaki and Yorisura. So you then you then she tell you ever torn it till Sabaki and give up your marriage. Also to get to come back, Kenjan to Tom and give up your marriage. Maybe Shaya tell her, you ever maybe you then go down in Sabaki and for Yeshe. Shaya, you mean you then don't do a chat with the Thomas. All this to do so.
So then there is finally this showing the impossibility of seeing flaws as they are in the sense faculties. So the commentary to this then explains that it follows that it is not certain that by meditating on the suffering of the sense faculties, etc., one will see them as flawed, because we also see those sense faculties as having good qualities through attachment that superimposes good qualities that do not exist on them, exist in them otherwise. So here it's not just the case that there are, say, good qualities in something and that is what causes us to generate attachment toward those objects, but we can superimpose through our own kind of improper thinking. We can add on and sort of, again, superimpose or exaggerate the qualities of something like our sense faculties, and that can then cause us to give rise to attachment. So again, the root verse of this says that we also see those through attachment that superimposes good qualities that do not exist otherwise.
Oh, yeah, that do it, and the shed, and that is to the direction. Turn to an ace. Caressana. Tagiwa, Tungeto, Congress, Tagiwa, Tagi, Lutan, Beta, no one else about to make it junior race, something to combalatene, and the Shajapa do race, it's a belaswa. Oh, this order. Tagiwa, Tungeto, Combe, Tagiwa, the Shimba, the Chitari, and nearby Miteva Tase. Tagiwa, the Shimba, Shimba, the Nun, and it's all in Pambata de Umar, Te kombe shempa te yula neba meba chandu chuba chandu sebe ese. Tagiwa tutule kyunzen do kombe. Tagiwa tunge ki tunge do kombe. Tagiwa tunge mabu yungure sa telete tunge mabu chiki do samna. Komba la tene. Tagiwa shenja de tawane chidar pondi pomba chetu umare so. Chidar ya neba miteba ta. Shenja de la nune tawane neba sotu umare so ta. Te kombe shemba de jula neva meva chendo chuva chambu seviche. Kera shemba de ya tungedo kongore se ni shenja chendo re se mato. Te tsawe jude ta rawa ta do chemba rawa ta gi wa chemba. Te neva yo mare se gora. Te kombe shemba de jula neva meva chendo chuva chambu seviche. Jula neva tsawe jude la neva meva se. Te mai de chashe la chili ani chendo te chene. Nyamu segre sambiwa de ti se tu maris chai ki nyamu ki tu tangji di de de ore ta khele go ro tangji raje da rawa ta khele go ra rawa ta de na sam sa sam ti me ma na shi te de na e ta tu me che kom na ko nyamu chawa de se tu maris go da sheba de chula no ba me ba re chira ko me ti tu me che do ko me de be ye ro shen ja ge chai ju de no yo maris no ba me ba che shanda je ne chi Nega Mamsita, Tumeva some combatant Sebe, Tetam Place. Tanzila Junsa Yamini Veches. Shebat Tari to the Neva Meva Neva Medi, Ram the Tadu Zimbabwe, Junsa Yamini, Tikra, Takel, and the Uasigora. All this to Nani de Chitaba Joshua.
So then there is the summary here. And so again, this is responding to a Vaisesika opponent who would say that by meditating on the suffering, of what pertains to a self, one can achieve liberation. And so the summary then responds to that by saying how, by meditating on the suffering of what pertains to the self, can one damage that desire for what pertains to the self? It follows that it cannot be accepted that one can, because by meditating on that, one performs a meditation that just does not damage the cause of that desire. Because through that meditation, there's no damage to self grasping in the least. So, as for what the Vaisesikas assert, they would say that the attachment to what is mine, there's this idea of a self, and that kind of attachment to the self is what gives rise to suffering. So by meditating on the suffering that arises from that, one can get rid of such attachment to the self. Well, now the response is that, well, that kind of meditation on the suffering of that which pertains to the self does nothing to damage this fundamental apprehension of such an autonomous or self-sufficient kind of self. And so long as you are not doing anything to damage that kind of grasping at such a autonomous or self-sufficient kind of a self, then you're not going to be able to get rid of the root cause that is leading to one's suffering. And so or actually you can't even get rid of the kind of attachment to that self. So that is because it doesn't do this kind of meditation that is just focused on recognizing that which pertains to the self as being suffering does nothing to damage the cause of that desire, because through that meditation there is no damage to self-grasping in the least. So again, this is sort of finishing the debate with a Vaisesika opponent and saying that as long as you have that self-grasping, as long as you're only meditating on the suffering of what pertains to the self, you're not damaging that self-grasping, and thereby you're not able to get rid of the fundamental cause for that attachment to the self and thereby the suffering that results.
Oh yeah, that Chitrapatu Zuki, Darkening your Doji Rawashin, the Darkening, Dakiwa Kening your did somebody or where needs the company or not. Did somebody pump where never child. Did somebody said that Tarbatoba Kening your Tabatu to many tend to Kening or a thing, Shenja to the form of Taxi Kening or or dear, the little gentleman to take a Yeshe and nigger pointing mother. So I didn't point to get down it over to Lambisha to go on. Oh, dear, you did number 7. You motive she told the Rawe Tatu Zimbata, Rawe Mata, Mai, some the summer shoots of Dora. Tell it any emotion that you go. The dear Raja shining in my sheets to the summer to shining. Shanda can to take some in a nigger that hanging in much more to toast or good. So I never saw two matters. So you did down the Tabit Zimbata. Take me to Shagado Asti, so you did Tasha, Shanda Chasha and children can to Tadana. Never. Yamondo, what they are, going per se. Can you see about the better market? In a Yomo, Sawane, Pantobati of Maris, Geshe, or teaching about it.
So here again, this is refuting or debating with a Vaiseshika opponent who asserts that there is some kind of a self. For them, a self-sufficient self, an autonomous, a permanent, singular, unitary kind of a self is actually existent, and so that that self and that which pertains to the self, those actually exist, and they assert that there is liberation for that self. And that liberation occurs due to getting rid of that attachment of what pertains to the self. So again, we refuted this by looking at how, well, the basis of all of our various afflictions is this apprehension of a self. And if one does nothing to damage that cause, even if we see the sort of fault of attachment that arises out of that, one isn't getting rid of that root cause. So if you leave the root cause just as it is, and don't see any fault in that, as Vaiseshikas don't see a fault in apprehending an autonomous self, a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, then even if you, by meditating on the fault of attachment, you can temporarily, say, suppress some of your afflictions, you're not doing anything to get them from their root. And thus, this is not that it's totally unbeneficial to, say, meditate on the flaws of attachment, but it's not something that is able to remove the root of samsara, that grasping at a self.
Oh, yeah, that's you by Tanzania loaded. Number Sunday, but a champagne Java to them. Tanzania, she's a new Shutanga, Tangachikela, Namshashi, Tanzania, she's a new Shutanga, Tankele. In the Tarbata, called the Tankele to them, Washura, or the Lushedora. Tadia, Tadi Chipura, Dojira, Rawa, Tanda Chipare, and Tarbatoba, Yeshe, and Tarbatoba, Lam the Karisha, Jolam the Karisha, Dakuram, Dovanashi, I think Maris Nabachanas, and do totally Gora. Then we were Tanzania, look up on a Sumsa. Rashin, Kibutada to ship or some Joram the Mitas, like Tanzania, Rashin, Kibu Kansarva. Rashin, Chito says, Shalda, Chito said, somebody knew to Tanzania about the Chito of the shelter. Tanzania Hache, but I have a singing with and she was in a Oju Chamber of what the dog said, Mother Chito said, what I said. Chito the young did it, the Mindu City, Castle. Or Pembo, the Mindu City, Pembo, Susu to West Pembo is a young star of Kanga, Koya Kanga to be Yeshe. Garajo Desati to Casa, Sedi Bazu Casa, being Bangsachi says to her, Tambu Tambu says she can't get in it or this or it. Chito tell it to the Chonga, you are there. Chito said. And he said the Chito was for. Shetam de Rashi by Yeshe, Chito de Gagal kept the young championship by the chip in the shadow. I did it. Transit look up on Sunshine. Rashi that you would have to share about some Jalamis. Ranshin's the Chito de Da, Chetam Jegi, Ranshiam, Chetam Jegi, and then Ranshin Chito de Eswara, Chito de Da, Kansa you did Tade the Shepate, and then Tavato de Jalami Sheba. Ranshin and Gibutade do Shebatam Jolam to Mite, Tumegi, Yitumba Chandegi, Turmite, Tatan Tande de Chibashira, Tumegi, and so Tumarcheva, Nava Chebate. Chagde Tisabutan and to make it good. Chagde Ranshin Vesson, Chagde said, Tabaton the Kadis Kubush and Timas watch a Sumba. Tadambo Rashida Kibu Tade the Shebaton Telam the Menwadi, Sheva. Tanzemba Nari Kocha Tarnase. Also, your legend of Toma Koetuda. Also, your legend of Toma Chitaba Savanas. Also, your legend of Toma the Koetusha. Mianola soba lula soba to the Gendo Tomate, Tabato the Jewish, the killing me Asura. Also, Yendendo Toma, Koe Juda, Gendo Tomate, Tabelamdo, Kebelegi, Talamares, Talamares. Ona Kares, not Talam Kare, Talam Kares. Ona Chishana, the Soji Ranshi Das, Tadungela soba, Swat, the Soji Ranshi Das. Kibuni le chito sembe se, te so di ranshi chito te da, kibuni le chito sembe chakwa de koe gyuye la se. Tini soso ro she da, te so di ranshi da, chito da kibuni soso kaba yinba she so na, di te ram de se wara. Tini yesu da, kansa da, chito nibu te, ya tidu ki ranshi nibu, tidu ki ranshi se na, tewe ranshi se na, tewe chito te wara, chito to chito da. Tini sosoro shebe kiburani ki londoro eserese. Ani chakbate dodo ese. Kibu chakde do gyure. De soji rashi da kibu tate do ngusumdo sheba ni talam ino talam garese na. Kibu chakde do gyure es. Ini lamde karese. De soji rashi da kibu tate do ngusumdo sheba ni talam ino tate da. Chito da. Kibu ni di tate do ngusumdo sheba da. Geshe Rashi is the Chotam Jagger Rashi, Chito Sigara, Pumbe Rashi, Tawe Rashi, Sugar Rashi, Chito the Rashi Sebe. Geshe Rashi said the Chotam Jagger Rashi said, Chotam Jagger Rashi is the Chito the Sigara. Oh, I Kibu Rani Gilodo, Kibu Chade do Gure, Geshe Rashi, Kibu Tade do Musu do Shebani, Talamino, Shenas, or the Badajidona.
So then we turn to a refutation of the Samkhya kind of theology. And so according to the Samkhyas, this is, they believe that everything or all knowable objects are enumerated in these 25 categories. And so these categories include something which is called kind of prakriti, I'll use the Sanskrit word, and purusha, which is the person. So prakriti is like the kind of principle or basis, that which is underlying everything. And there is then this person or purusha, a self. And so according to the Samkhyas, they assert that there is a self, like we have seen with the Vaisesikas, a self that is a kind of singular, a permanent, singular, autonomous kind of an entity. They assert that there is such a self, and there are then within those Samkhyas those that assert that there is some kind of a deity, there's a sort of theistic version of Samkhya, where they are, this general principle is connected with kind of a divinity that is creating all of the various manifestations. And then there's a non-theistic kind of a version. And so the Samkhya theory could perhaps overlap with some sort of scientific theories about the nature of the universe and sort of that pervading all things, the Big Bang Theory, and etc. Anyway, so this kind of understanding of the Samkhyas is what leads them to assert a particular sort of a path to liberation. So here, the refutation of Samkhya soteriology is beginning with the unacceptability as a path to freedom of just knowing that Prakriti, this general sort of principle, this nature that underlies everything, and Purusha, the person, are different. And so here, then the second topic is the unacceptability as a cause of detachment, of having a mind afflicted by the suffering of suffering, and then identifying the nature of detachment. And so here, the Samkhya opponent, as it begins in the commentary, says, according to us, it cannot be accepted that seeing the sense faculties, etc., as having good qualities is the cause of samsara, or that seeing them as flawed is the path to liberation. So for them, they don't agree with this idea that that is the kind of way in which samsara operates, or that by seeing something as flawed, you could achieve liberation. But instead, if you ask what our view is, it is this. Because the attached mind that apprehends prakriti, and in the Tibetan, they're using this word nature, the word ramshin, which we often translate as nature, but this is really referring here to this general kind of principle, which if you ask what our view is, it is this: because the attached mind that apprehends prakriti, which is pleasure, etc. So all of the things that we enjoy and interact with are asserted to be this prakriti. And Purusha, the person, as one. So when our mind apprehends those to be as one, that is the cause of samsara. And because by knowing these two as separate, one rejects the belief that prakriti is Purusha, then since the Purusha is free from attachment, that direct knowledge that prakriti, which is pleasure, etc., and Purusha are different, is the path to freedom. So again, for them, this idea of liberation comes down to recognizing that our self, this Purusha, is actually separate from this fundamental kind of nature of this prakriti, which pervades everything. And so for them, they would say that the way that one attains freedom is by recognizing that the person is actually separate from this underlying fundamental sort of nature of all things.
Oh yeah. Tarashita Kibu Tade do Musum do Sheba some disable to a my bartas, Taralu Pasiba. Shito Rashita, the so de Rashan, Bube Rashi, Chutam de Rashi, Chito Tedashura. Kibuni, Kasai, Tade do Musum do Sheba Zangi, Sibale to Mare Sigura. Sibale to my bartas. Lamla Mazambe, Chibeti or Chibasoki to the Mishora. Lamla Yatan and Mazambe, Tabato, but at the Lamla Mazambe, Chibeti or the Yesora, the Soke Yesora, the Rangi Rodanse, the Sogi Ranshile, Kibutani Tade do Shever, Juruesis, Tonam Bachena, Chidangi Kansa to Soge, and Lamla Mazambe Kansa to the Chibesoki. Rangi Wombuta, Miwana, Chimana Sobara, Nitawa Dungera Sobat, the soldier Ranshinde, Tani Tade to Shepherd Guruesher, the number 10 to Richard No, Punge Ranshida, Kare Ranshida, Tare Ranshinde, Kavai, but they could shed in the future. I know Condu Ranshindi, Tisam Vesili, Meta, Tai or no. Tade to do Vasibes, Tete, Kibutani, Tondo Niwa Borshene. Kibutani, Tawala Sabatando Yabo Senese, Tatar Yombuta, Tawale Soto Gubashin, Tondo Neviches, Tanda Sosu, Miwana Sabatu Yabumena, Tile Yagachichuna, Samsa, Chemikamina, Chemikatongere Chiora, Tukuna, Rangshin to Shembam Tag, Rangshin to Shembam, Tehaku, Duaswara, Tawandonga, one bola Sabatu. Tewandile haba chishanda chesa chune chesa sobode yabu medu nebare sobu sabachi be tango yabu chesa chune chesa mbirwa sako teso di ranshinte da korani de kaga imbati hago doasi gora ngade chesa chune sabi omara nga sosu sha sosu dewa na lyohanda teso mi yabu mene tesa ni chebja doa leba da nalo na jetu chebja doa Otine si chevi capta chivene chevi jago samsang duas. Tiyan jo mogo te rangshi te da soso kaga imbate ti singi duas igora. Kibu dani desan. Keso je rangshi le kibu dani tade do kibu shebe se terde. Kibu dani tondo nyewa borsene ase soso tondo nyewa borsene. Tadar je wangbo da ase tada yeba soso mewa nawa da sheba sebo meba da mi sebo meba da. Anjo tanda meba tozo tachi nalo na chalo tozo chebi gasar juni chebi gagra pesa chebi gado akache chebi gagra to tada di wambo tadele chodo je basha tado nyevecher teda ko wambo ranshi te da tangi te da soso kaga imbate konjo ako yo reskura rani ngaji chibdu sonne ase rani ta rani soso ngaji chibdu sonne normally da tanda yoga simba yoga ne ta ta banji yorno ngaji chibdu sonne rangi teso kinji chibare tobe loja imbe chese rangi tewada dungenda teso pachi duwada shi yobashe soso te kadui ne tenge sobe se tangzi yorna tunji zisigra o teso da rangi teso kinji chibare tobe loja imbe chese pizzawa di birda choshe tondo nye chedas soso miwa nawa da tewala soba sheba teso chesa chuna tele chodo gyubachi chune chebe gyawin sam samlu duwa 근데 소수다 되게 가가임바도 삼로도가 대화님이 가가임바 소수다 명화 가가임바 근데 명화게 랑시다 소수이바데 신기 어레스 왔다 나머지나 명화다 가가임바 신원부대다 가가임바 신기 뒤랑시다 가가임바 신기도 왔어 대소비 랑시다 기부 가가임바 하고도 왔을 건데 기지로전 얘기 주세 대소로 소바도 단다도 맹주와 비디오 게기 기지 제베스 되레레스 거라 다 고란데 뒤뒤지 제가만 단대에 단대 마오가 대결이 삼도 와시거라 기지 로제 교원대 원소를 단에 타대지 지난 담에에 교 대소가 근데 다데 소소대 아니 지조랑시 왕보다 원소의 랑신다 소소 가가이 메신기도 와시 원소다 가가이 메신기도 와디 원소의 랑신도 가가이 메신기오레서 다 남바전 뜻주비와라 어디 버지 투바디 지구나
So, here, then again, the Samkhya is going to say that it is then the path to freedom involves apprehending that this fundamental nature of all, this sort of fundamental principle or the nature of all phenomena and the self, the person, are different. It is that recognition of them as being different that is the path to freedom. And so Gyaltsab replies to this by saying that it follows that one is not freed from samsaric existence merely by direct knowledge that Prakriti and Purusha are different. Because even a foolish person, inexperienced on the path, knows that Purusha, or the person, has a different self nature from their sense faculties, and Prakriti, which is pleasure, etc. So it follows that this is so. Because that foolish person, desiring to be a striver for the Purusha itself, will strive for other objects, sense faculties, pleasure, etc., that are superior to those that they have at present. So here, we can generally say that even a foolish person or someone who has not much learning is able to understand that the self or the person is separate or different from both the sense faculties, the means by which we enjoy various things, and those things that we enjoy. We recognize that they are of a different nature, like you can recognize that a pot and a pillar are different things. So we can know this from direct kind of example in that, say we were offered to be able to change our current sense faculties for those of another. We would be very much willing to do that. If we saw something that was superior in terms of other sense faculties than those that we have at present, we would strive for those, saying, well, myself will take some better eyes, or if my ears are deficient, I'll take some better sense powers and so forth. And so, because we have that natural sense that we would be willing to exchange, say, the current sense faculties that we have, or the body that we have that's maybe degenerating, or even the objects of pleasure that we have, we can say that we recognize those to be different from the self. So, it follows that this is so because even that foolish person desiring to be a striver for the Purusha itself, so that the person itself will strive for other objects, sense faculties, pleasure, etc., that are superior to those that they have at present. And because apprehending the fact that the self is identical in earlier and later moments, they have a mind that cognizes that their own pleasure, etc., are subject to arising and destruction. And so here, a person is able to recognize, although they're holding that the person is the same at earlier and latter moments, they recognize that the pleasure that they experience doesn't last. It's something that is going to be destroyed. It's something that is subject to destruction. So again, this kind of innate sense that even an unlearned kind of person has, that if they could exchange better sense faculties for the ones that they currently have, they would do so. If they could get better eyes or better ears, they would do that. That implies that they recognize the person is different from those things. And it also is the case that even though we apprehend there as being like a permanent person, the pleasures that that person experiences are not apprehended to be permanent. We recognize that those are subject to destruction. And so this is something that ordinary beings already recognize. It follows that one also is not attached to samsaric existence through the mind seeing Prakriti and Purusha as identical, because it is unacceptable that just knowing those two as different be the cause of freedom. So the root verse for this says, a person knows that they have a different self nature from their sense faculties because they will strive for others that are superior, and because they have a mind subject to arising and destruction. One is also not attached through seeing those two as identical because of that.
Oh, that Rashida Kibuni, Rashida Kibuchini, the Tonshi Shemba, some did not. Sibale Chaba, my Bataras, I don't know Basiba. Rashi, Chito Rashi, Teda, Kibuni, Chini to Tonshi Shemba, some did not. Sibale Chaba, Mares, and Mazukoa, the Nelu Jula Soba, Chashiki, Rashida Kibuni Chitu Toanatani, the Medwasi. Rashida Kibuchi to Lo Toshi Shemba Tamgita, Sibari Chapa member task, Tini Tade do Sheba Tam, Tolamdi Turmetevesi, Tada Chito ni Tade do Sheba Tam, Tolamdu Mitavatan Tarsha Sara, Ojeda, Rashida Kibuni Chini to Tomati, Tony Shemba Tam, Tigan Sibari Chapa Maibata, Tini Tade do Sheba de, Tolam Maiba, Tonaiba Miteva Sheba, Shes and Bitches. Miteva Tisha. Ranshin said the color is no called the Bertolasi. Ranshin said the Kodur, Mudur Mare, Kodur, Maradunus to Tomato. Ranshin called the Bertolas, Chitola Sigris, Ranshin said. Kibuda teso tate do shenase. Kibuda ragi tawada tene tungela soba teso sosuda tate do shena. Teso je ranshi tanya tate do shenese. Kansa sosu de tawada tate do shena ni te ranshi tanya tate do shebarese. Ni kibuda teso tate do shebidoase. Ta namben do nashi chani titugura. Kibuda teso tate do shena. Teso je ranshi tanya tate do shebura. Shenje je loda ranshi ni pembuda. Delia ko shenje de lom chambu sabe ngaranzu chena. Namba chena loda sheba ripotunjira. Tanda dili tanjemba de lom chambu sabe pembu shagyorya. Lom chambu chibare. Shenje yusra de nana yusrange nana lom chambu chiso se jorda. Shenje je loda ranshi ni pembu se. Loam chambu lote da ranshi ni bude pembu rese. Tutu tuve pembu rese wara. Sheba nga duna she pembu maingel shagyo wara. Sheba de lote da. Loam chambu shate lote. Shenje je loda ase melongo nipa tabu se. Tadi nga zon myoangu sura se. Chilo yude tsusha inaangi kibule su lentengere. Melongo nipa tabu dole sha dina lote su kibule lentengere. Tende shagdo loam chambu shate. Pembu che. Melongo nipa tabu nisari se. Shegida. Rangshini kodo gyurbe zola serve kibudan deso dedikso. Shenje ge lodan rangshini pembudan o pembure tutu tuwa deso lodan ane chiso mide rangshini bude rangshindan chiso uchibare pembudan kibu riban dedo se kibu diyan sheban degre tadan sheba riba ichibare ta shirigi kibu shidwa tanjege 다다 sheba riba kibu de tenji da shiri di kibu se lo de ya kaware sheba mare tembore lo chebode kibu riba de do se tena dala charba de chese rande koe ju rande koe tunge di ju hindes tena dala charba de chese rande koe ju hinde kisi chini tonge ja chami dala charba de ore tamalo sentiment Chakpa de Chocha. Tena Dala Chakpa de Chocha. Rande Koya Juyinde. Rande Koya Juyinde. Kyege Rando Gi. Soso Rangi Be Nagi. Yala Miso Ombula Mooni Gi. Cheso Chakpa. Dembar Jushe. Kyo Danzin Gi. Rando Le Tambe Echer. Ota Rangu Pasi Dwa. It was. Tena Dala Chakpa de Chocha. Rande Koya Juyinde. Dala Chakpa de Koya Juyinde. Kyege Rambo Gi Sola Soba La Mibe Nagi Yana Gi Miso Omula Mooni Gi Jesu Chashinse Tene Chakpa de Rangi Mibe Nawa Nachela Soba Ya Mooni Gi Jesu Chakpa Demba Chibese Yusa Kye Danjin Gi Randu Le Chakpa Eche Chakpa Koran de Dadu Zimberwa Chakpa de Zawa Chisa de Danjin Gi Chakpa de Namba Chana Kasa Dadu Zimbadegi Nada ngai samsani ngai wale chabada tal chabada tempo ora no ya de chabada shense ke dang jingi ran dole chambe o ti godo sawa de chena ti chingi to ya ja chami dala chabada dala chi to ni chi do to ya wang chabada wa ma de se la dala chabada bibe na ge ya la mo ni de che chang yo lo se Yala migra sopa la wombo la ngoni di chesu chapa jamba shirese. Mibe nange yala la ngoni di chesu stande ode chikishana.
So here, then it follows that one also is not attached to samsaric existence just through the mind's seeing Prakriti and Purusha as identical and by desiring their identity, because it is unacceptable that just knowing those two as different be the cause of freedom. So again, it comes down to this idea that understanding these two to be different cannot be accepted as the cause of freedom, because we can naturally see that persons are able to recognize that they're sort of different from the things that they enjoy. And so it can't be that it is the cause of samsaric existence that identifying Prakriti and Purusha as identical is then the cause of samsaric existence. So, continuing in the commentary, it says Prakriti is said to be chiefly a hidden phenomena. But if one knows that Purusha, the person, and pleasure, and the other qualities of Prakriti are different, one can also know that Prakriti, which has the qualities of pleasure, etc., is different from Purusha. So here, even though we would say that this kind of nature or a fundamental principle, this generality, the sort of principle that pervades all phenomena, is a hidden phenomena, one is able to recognize that this is something which is different from the person or the self. So because one can see that the qualities are different, then one can see that this underlying sort of generality, even if it is something that is hidden, is different from the person. So the desirous mind and prakriti are both ascertained to be physical and purusha to be consciousness. So this desirous mind, and again, this gets back to the sort of Samkhya assertions that there is first this general principle, this soul or main kind of general principle nature that is underlying all phenomena. And that is asserted to be physical. And so too is what they call this great mind or the intellect. Here it's referring to this desirous mind. They would also assert that this is something that is physical. This great intellect or great mind is like a mirror that is reflecting something back, like in the way that our a visual sense power, for example, a physical object is sort of projected into that, and that's how we apprehend that particular object. So too with this great mind, it is something that is physical. So for them, this word lo is translated as mind usually, and for most Buddhists, we would say mind and consciousness and awareness. Those are all synonyms, but here for them, this great mind is something that is considered to be physical, and the person, and so for them, the four terms self, person, consciousness, and awareness are all synonyms. They're all interchangeable. The person is asserted to be consciousness. And so we can recognize fundamentally the difference between that consciousness and the things that are its object. So again, recognizing them as different as something that we can do kind of automatically. So continuing in the commentary, it says, thus, that attachment to self is the cause of resultant samsaric suffering, because by its own power, attachment will naturally be drawn to the internal factors, the visual and other faculties that intend, form, etc., because it is drawn by the power of self-grasping itself. So as long as we have this sense of a self, we're going to have attachment or be drawn to these internal faculties that apprehend, form, and so forth. It's drawn by this power of self-grasping itself. So as long as we are apprehending a self, there's going to be attachment to that I and that mind, including like apprehending the sense powers and so forth. And so the root verses for this say, one is also not attached. One is also not attached through seeing Prakriti and Purusha as identical. Because of that, that attachment to self, attachment will naturally be drawn to the internal factors that intend, form, etc.
Yure Devas, Tunisia, Tandana, Devas, original Yuja Kumere, Devaraj Degma, Yure Tunisia, Kaban Vici Tunisia, comes from the Yada Yamube, Shawadi Tuni, Pumbuka, Kaban Vici Tunisia, or dinner to make this. You were to make it, ye Tumbeas, this also similar collection, you Tumbe. Chaldegi Gurumite Banes, to make it, ye Tumbati, Chaldegi, you did not tell ya, Chaldegi to the Carison, you did not tell a minute to make it, so can you take you that? Tell a minute any Chaldegi Chabat the Geshe. Or did take Marishiba. To make combat cover, you days, to make it Tumbe says, Takane Chungsona Sura. 이 종신에서 때는 semba nema shenja yogerina kotele 이 jugura atakale dosapsataje 이 nema shenja yobatele 이 기초 sembalone 수주와 그래 이 중시거나 동네지 동배체 이 중시 껴내서 semba 껴내 차대는 기로 통해서 동네 공부되게 전된 동네를 참고를 줘도 니카시 까미 전부 중수나 이거 셈 껴내 Italia scienza abbiamo fatto due senassi, tu ne abbiamo piccia sicura. C'è da due tonne c'è na asa, che c'è da c'è. Ora è discussione.
So then we turn to the next point, which is the unacceptability as a cause of detachment, having a mind afflicted by the suffering of suffering. So again, according to Buddhists, there are three types of suffering. There's the suffering of suffering, what we all recognize and know as being suffering. There's the suffering of change, and then there is the suffering of pervasive conditioning. And so again, the suffering of suffering is something that we all know and recognize as being suffering. The suffering of change includes those kinds of things like a pleasurable sensation that doesn't actually remain. It's not really in the nature of being pleasure, but rather is subject to becoming suffering. And then there is the suffering of pervasive conditioning, in that we have taken up these appropriated aggregates due to the force of karma and the afflictions. And so here, for some, they would say that renunciation, this sense of like being thoroughly sick of something, comes just from contemplating the suffering of suffering. And so the opponent here says then, one will be freed by meditating on suffering, because we see that when one is afflicted by suffering and becomes renounced, having regretted the suffering, one becomes renounced. So we all can know from experience that when we are experiencing a great deal of suffering, when we're going through something very challenging, we give rise to renunciation. We have this sense of wanting to be freed from that kind of suffering. And so this opponent is then alleging that one will generate renunciation based upon sort of regretting or being dissatisfied with that suffering.
Kibu Kashi, Taralu Palanja, Kibu Kashi, Tatar Soa Tunenki, Tatar Soa Tunenki, Tumbe, Kebe, Injun Tendeshus, O Kansa Gasilia, Tatar Soa Tumere Chinadeva, Nata Shivchina, Net to make it, Tumne Narneva, Nikebe, Injun Tendeshus, Ata, Tamadusa, Neko Yijundura. Namdinasi dek mato, injun tigre sertelia, kami kira sidar. Kibu kasi, tada soa tumeki, tumbe, kebe, injun tenda chesa. Shedanda sungde nam te ju yenji, chade mayin barta, ko tumeki, jube tumni techidi, shidelia chabada trebe suduto, shinja yungu marade, Kuchida Shinja da Dra Mare Chamba da Dra Mare Sivora, Kibu Tenda Chuse. Shida da Tunde Nam Chijane Ko Kondisa Sivora. Mishanda Chebe Kamirjin Kondisa Yevora. Tasi in a social swat to me, Kiwiches. Swat to me the Kondi Jurua. Sebamiki Vachasana, Kondisa Yora. Sako Shinja da Dra Mare Yananico Kondisa Sivora. Shedanda Sungdana, they doing the Shedaki Juche Jury, and I checked my butter, Kik give a day, say, Kik, Dengi, Tudela, Chaba Yevesha, Tanda, Chochi de la Cotume, Nani, the Shenda question that day or this was Shendalia. Kik give a day, say, Kik, Dengi, Tudela, Chaba Yevesha. Chaba Yede, Chaba Yevasa, the Nega Shella, Hagwa Chana, so, Google Chota, the Meros and the Manas and Tita Shichira, Oshinja Yotan, Tapsichira. He Shinja Yovata, the Nega Shella, Hagwa Chana, Kange River, tell and Nega Tonas and Tita and Bezuship Chimichira. She's a call to me. Shinja Yovata, this water. The Nega Shella, Hagwa Chana, service. Shida, Jundu Kiana, Chaba Kiwe, Gugab Jombe, Antidote, or Dibba, Sawa Session Division. Kanshi Tadar Dunga, Kanshi Tadar Dunga, Injun and that Tani Kisa, Tanda Dumeshi, which is from the Telia, June, join in a ya, to make case of Utiliaco, Shenja, Marite, Ina, Tandako, Shenja, your days, Chijinico Condria, Yagaris. Shedanda to the Shiva Yagaris. Injun tender dying is complicated as well. Yana Kondomaju in a nation that Tama take to the Havachichona. Did I travel to the Hava to send the Bezuchi Grisora? Chante Maisi, they say I tell you caption to she teleco, Shenja to the Mado, Shenda go Chante Maris or a Tesia, Chai caption to make the name of Yaga child in a tip and child of Dalia, Bezushi Chamichi to us or a caption to make the neck of the Guru Shan to me, never neck of the Maya to Dalia, Tashi Chamichi to watch the Shenja or the Sura. So what did child caption to all this Duna?
So here, Gyaltsab responds to that by saying that it follows that a renunciation like that, arising through some person's present feeling of affliction by the suffering of suffering, is concomitant with aversion, or it is the cause of aversion, but it is not detachment. So because at that time that renunciation arises, there exists attachment in the person whose mind stream includes renunciation. So here we could all, when we are in a situation of the suffering of suffering, we're experiencing some kind of bad situation, feel renunciation towards that. Like, well, I want to get out of this suffering situation, and thereby we are without attachment toward that particular kind of suffering experience. But it's not that sort of recognition of suffering as suffering leads to detachment, because that renunciation, as they're saying here, is actually acting as a cause for aversion or for hatred. So for example, when we get unhappy, when something goes against our wishes, that is the kind of seed that then has us give rise to anger. So when we are in a suffering situation, we can actually give rise to aversion, this sense of like hatred or anger toward that which is foiling our plans. But that's not detachment. And there's also, when we are in a suffering situation, a desire to get out of that suffering situation. We have attachment towards a situation in which we aren't suffering. And so thereby that mind that is recognizing the suffering as suffering is not actually a mind of detachment. Because again, we see first that it can act as the cause of aversion, or it's sort of concomitant with aversion and acts as the cause of anger and hatred. And it actually is not the case that a person's mind is without attachment, because there's an attachment toward this sense of, can I be in a better situation? Could I be in a non-suffering situation? So when we are actually searching then for a better kind of situation from our suffering, or wanting to get out of that, at least when we're only contemplating the suffering of suffering, it actually, we still have attachment within our mind stream. So renunciation like that, arising through some present suffering, is aversion, but it is not detachment. At that time, there exists attachment, because craving another occasion for happiness, one seeks it. So this kind of assertion that recognizing suffering or meditating on suffering and generating renunciation gives rise to attachment is not tenable.
Wait a minute. Shida Gundu Kiena, Chaba Give, Captain the Chanda Gibson, Yakaji Suda, Kondo Sesava Devina, and the Chabadi Mavachag was a take up the Chanda to us in Nasigora. Takari Chili Kondo Sagani, Teleshinjadi Gimato. Shida Gundu Kiena, Chaba Give, Kugapchon Bears, and Chabaki to Mato, Kubioma Ratiki. Chagdedo Yurushina Shida Kondo Sese Partilia, any Chagde do Atilishin Muduashina Sigura. Shida Jengi Kibu Church, Shida gave a some Chagde to go a Maibata, the Kondo Sava Sambico Chagde Ringmar, Kondo Sava Utiliaco, Negam Chapa the Trail, Girete, Inako Chagde Mari Chapashenda, give Resigata. Shida gave a some Chagde to go a Maimba Talsa. Shidantene Choa Dume Tisidu, Ne Yes for Tamandivisionati, Nene Badoko Kondo to Tegren, Tamandibadi Dixona, Yamuchasona, Nico Kondo Lodua, Young Manashi, Shinzaki Akademi Tagarajati, or the Chadeke Madame Negriga, Chagma Kimadu, Kondo is give a Kuramas or the Mado, Tishu Deora. Shidantene Choa Dume Tisisam Duneki Lona, Rani, Chagzengi Rashin. La temperature Namju, Charging by some Shakari Taranko, Yangati Jalo Chigrimado, till Targamaris. Rani charging the Rashila la temperature series. Dangama tells Shidan didn't try to make to see something tell Lona, Rani, this is something grace, this is something never Tasa, so to make it, Kushan in Becher. Choa Dungengi Dujan Bichel, Choa Dungengi have been beauty or this, but oh, having with Choa Dichilashana. Shidan Dungengi Dujanches, Shidadi Dungengi have been beauty or this, or Tenegam Natani, the system de Shidan give a Kadilla, Shidan Utiliaco Chabaki Marwa, or this Shidan give a little condo, Sese Baduti Mando Badu Tegris, then it is system to that. The law nani se tramadu with the mail chasna, Pune, the nature mail chasna, young manasha chavris. The law nani, the lawfulness. The law nani rani, the rashinile, Nimakari in a tinashina, Chapachin to do grace. What is to
So then the opponent comes back with this idea that, well, when aversion arises continually, so through the meditation on suffering, one will feel this aversion continually. And so one will have destroyed any possible occasion for the arising of attachment. So one will be detached. So they're basically trying to say that so long as one is focused on this suffering and has a kind of aversion toward it, or even an anger toward it, well, then you can't give rise to attachment. So the response then is, it follows that an averse person will not become detached merely through the arising of aversion, because that aversion remains only so long as the suffering feeling. So suffering feelings are temporary. They are things that arise occasionally. And so it is then not the case that we could sort of continually have this feeling of anger, because we're only going to have the feeling of anger or aversion toward that suffering so long as the suffering is there. And suffering is occasional. And so once that has passed, we'll then return to attachment. We're not going to be completely freed from that kind of attachment. So, and he continues saying, when the feeling is absent, one will revert to one's own attached nature. It follows that the previous reason pervades because that aversion has the suffering feeling as its cause. So again, we give rise to this aversion or even anger from experiencing a suffering experience. And that is something that is caused, that is impermanent, and thereby isn't going to remain forever. So whenever that suffering cause is gone, so too will be the aversion, and we will revert back to our normal attached nature. So the root verses for this then say, um, uh, there exists attachment because, so sorry, it's in the middle of the verse. So when that is absent, as in the suffering, one will revert to one's own nature because aversion has suffering as its cause. So that aversion remains only as long as the suffering. When that is absent, that suffering, one will revert to one's own nature, being attached to various pleasures and so forth, because aversion has suffering as its cause. And as that is a caused thing, it is only occasional. Thus, you couldn't assert that you would become completely detached or permanently detached.
Oh yeah, that is, yeah.
So we'll then stop there for today
Oh yeah, no. Sorry, Joe. Yeah.
and see you all tomorrow.
Oh yeah.
Thank you.